From Sprue to You. Brian Ansell and Bob Naismith are playing with plastic. They talk to Sean Masterson about their plans to expand. It was pouring with rain, and the taxi driver was psychotic. I just sat there wishing there was a way I could close my eyes without looking conspicuous. It was only a drive across town to Citadel's Eastwood factory. The taxi driver seemed to be under the impression that it was a leg of the Lombard Rally. The trip made me feel happier about missing lunch, and by the time I had run to the cover of the reception area, the rain that had soaked through my jacket could do nothing to detract from the overwhelming sense of relief. Time to see the boss. As I entered the office, Brian Ansell, GW's managing director, and Bob Naismith, Citadel Miniatures' top man, were both looking fairly pleased with themselves. All I knew then was that they wanted to talk about plastics. So what's the big deal? They took the production samples of Citadel's Warhammer regiments that I had brought over from the studio and subjected the collection of sprues to close inspection. Brian turned to Bob. The weapons, the blades are all snapped. These areas are too weak. Bob nods and makes a mental note to deal with the problem after the interview. It's only a minor hiccup. Before long, the 60-figure boxed set will be on the shelves of game shops throughout the country. And that will be a major step forward, Brian elaborates. With the Warhammer regiments, we can produce the first viable 28mm plastic gaming miniature, every bit as good as a metal figure. He moves to the seat behind his desk. In the past, people have tried to make plastic wargames figures using primitive technology. Big companies have made model soldiers of more or less the right size, but they've missed the point of what is expected of a gaming miniature, by way of presence and stature, style and dynamism. Bob puts the claim into context. What we're trying to do here is to open the market in ways that we could never touch with metal, simply because of the cost of the miniatures. We can now reach an audience that we know is there. It all sounds like a grand master plan, but Citadel have spent years perfecting the detail and imagery of their metal figures. Nor have earlier experiments with plastics always been successful. Remember the fighting fantasy figures? Brian does. Every time we do something we learn a little bit more. Nobody could claim that our old 60mm plastics were a raving success, but we've learnt how to do all sorts of interesting things since then. We're finding possibilities now that the plastics industry never expected. When we were doing the plastic Space Marines, we mocked up some of what we wanted in metal and took them to a tooling specialist and said, "Right, we want these doing in plastic," and we were told, "It can't be done, mate." It wasn't considered feasible to get that level of detail and animation. Bob outlines the problems they faced. Capturing the look of a Citadel miniature in plastic was absolutely essential. The original sculpted figure, from which a plastic model is made, is designed 3 times larger than the final product. The problem we had with the fighting fantasy figures was in making a figure that looked awkward in its enlarged state. It was very difficult to visualize the final product from this perspective. But we're used to these techniques now. We've applied them successfully to the skeleton hordes and Space Marines. Now, when you stand the final miniature next to a metal one, it looks just fine. The other problem is that the realm of plastics is much more disciplined than metal. Metal figures are made in a rubber mould, which is very forgiving. There are often awkward traps and crevices, but because the rubber bends easily, you can get the figure out. And that's why you can also strive for attention to detail. But with a plastic figure, your mould is made of steel, and that isn't going to move. The only thing that will be damaged when removing the model is the figure itself, so if you leave the slightest trap or loophole in the mould, then the thing just won't come out. Considering the machine is automatic, slamming shut and reopening every 30 seconds, running 24 hours a day, this has to be avoided. Also, we're trying to get generic forms, your classic dwarf, your classic orc, things like that. But although everybody thinks they know what these things look like, when you're trying to find something typical, it's never quite that simple. I go through, say all our figures are orcs, and pick the ones that seem to be the most representative. The size, weaponry, clothes, and that sort of thing. Then I photocopy them up to 3 times their original size. Give the horribly grainy outlines you get to the figure designers and say, right, that's what you've got to work from. We use the same designer to make the plastic figures as we use to make the metal ones. For instance, Kevin Adams made the plastic master for the orc, and Jez Goodwin made the plastic master for the elf. It probably costs 1,000 times more to make a plastic figure than it does to make a metal one, so it's important to get the thing down pat. So does this mean that the variety that made Citadel's metal miniatures so popular is threatened by the new Rangers? Bob thinks not. Well, obviously that's where the metal miniatures come in. People can buy plastics and build the body of their army far more cheaply than is possible at the moment, and then be able to afford the metal generals and other special figures to give it that touch of individuality. Brian is also aware of loyalties and responsibilities. Eventually, of course, if it goes the way we think, we expect the bulk of things to be produced in plastic. But we don't think metal miniatures are ever going to go away. Partly because some people collect metal miniatures and they have got no reason to change now. But also because, however, many figures we make in plastic, we will still have the facility to make lots of special figures in metal. At the moment, we're selling more than 1 million metal miniatures a month, and I can't imagine that market disappearing overnight, whatever happens. But as we make plastic figures available and make gaming cheaper, we hope to expand the market. It's almost bound to substitute for some of the metal. We can see the hybrid plastic metal models coming now. Soon we'll be making war engines where the basic frame is made of plastic, but the detailed work is made in metal. The obvious thing to do is to provide the variety. The situation Citadel has finally reached marks the end of a long but ultimately satisfying struggle. Because we've come in from the cold and are starting from scratch, we're approaching a lot of the problems laterally. We're managing to sidestep a lot of the supposed shortcomings of plastics. It's been accepted in that industry that when you make a plastic model, whether it's animal or human, you get block off. We've all seen toy soldiers where the area beneath the arm or beneath the neck and chin lacks detail. So the butt of a soldier's gun suddenly swells to fill the gap between the weapon and his hip with a great wodge of plastic. You don't have to do it like that. It's your approach to making the model. To a large extent, it's what you're willing to accept. We know that certain standards are absolutely required by our customers and we can't fob them off with anything less. Bob agrees. You've got to use the best of everything. The people who are making our plastic moulds for us are the same people who make the moulds for the interiors of corgi cars and matchbox cars. They are skilled engineers. We sculpt the original in clay, a plasticine type material. Then we make a 2-part resin mould from that. We give the mould to the engineers who use a device with a probe at one end which is run around inside the mould. Everywhere that moves, a tiny little drill at the other end of the device moves in synchronization with it, but in only 1/3 of the distance or depth. It's got to enter a block of steel while it's following the pattern that the stylus at the other end picks up. It's called pantography. John Thornthwaite, often referred to as the man with no name in Culture Shock, has worked in this industry for a long time. He knows who we should be talking to and how to get the best results. So that's who he is. I ask Brian if the rest of the industry is aware of Citadel's activities. Yes, but we're still having to do more and more of the work ourselves. So we're becoming a real plastics company, doing most of the legwork because nobody else can. Doing everything by itself is in character for this company. But what about selling the techniques to other interested parties? Brian's clear on this too. No, this is for us. We're all doing what we really wanted to do when we were kids, aren't we? We're not interested in making grommets, otherwise we'd go out and get a real job. The potential is enormous, as Bob illustrates. We want to include figures in our games that are every bit as good as the ones you will see on a tabletop. Dungeon Quest, Dracula, Highway Warrior, all of them will have high quality plastic playing pieces. The thing is, add Brian, you can have these figures as just playing pieces or paint them up as tabletop quality models and give yourself that added visual appeal when you're playing the game. You have a choice where there wasn't one before. Bob continues, in Highway Warrior, the car combat game, you start off with a basic car and can add weapons to it as you go. We're also producing the 40k Land Raider, the APC, and a kind of tracked motorbike or dune buggy type model. The only problem I have now is getting enough time to do all of this. We're demanding more time of the figure designers. The other thing we're doing is plastic horses, proper war horses. Every manufacturer, including ourselves, who has tried to make cavalry has been limited by the cost of metal. The metal cavalry figures you see now are riding big ponies, but with plastics you can make the horses at the right scale without making them expensive, as metal ones would have to be. We will also make the parts interchangeable. The horse will be split down the middle, but all the different left and right halves will all fit together, allowing you to have as many variants as you can imagine. And the heads will be separate and in different positions, so from a very few basic parts, your choice will be tremendous. Then, of course, there's Citadel's new castle. It's something close to Bob's heart. What Brian said to me was, I want you to make me a castle, a basic castle. So I went away and asked people how hard they could make stuff in polystyrene. And they sent me this sample that was really light, but brick hard. In some ways, expanded polystyrene is a misnomer. It should be compacted polystyrene because it's so strong, and that's what they moulded this castle in. It's also got injection moulded plastic parts in the same way as the figures are made for doors, ladders and trapdoors. The tool makers made blank wooden castle wall sections and brought them over to us. I gave them to Trish Morrison, who scribed in all the stonework detail. She could only do this on certain surfaces of the castle, the front and back, because of the way the mould opens and closes. The intricate detail works well on this compacted polystyrene. When it's painted, you can't see any of the beads that make up the plastic itself. It just looks solid. Normally, absorption of the paint is a problem, but this compacted stuff takes paint very well. Acrylics being ideal because they're water-based and this is pretty waterproof. Enamels or plastic glue would melt it away. Having said that, you could use them to good effect if you wanted to make a damaged section of the wall, but for our test shots, the model was giving a once-over in grey, dry brushed with a lighter shade and had some flock stuck on it. It looked perfect. There wasn't even any need to undercoat it. And it's easy to customise as well. You can make keeps, cut walls to shape for different designs, connect wall sections to make a walled city even. The next thing Brian has in mind is plastic buildings. Build yourself a town. Then there's the Blood Bowl set, which will have a stadium and a special pitch, rather like AstroTurf. I ask Brian if he thinks there might be a problem with the castle being seen as a toy. We don't know. We're happy to accept sales from that direction, but we won't compromise the hobby end of the product. But it doesn't stop there. We're experimenting with a choice of separate plastic weapons for our figures, comments Brian. Wonderful if you're building armies. Then, if the plastic castle is popular, we may do extra bits for that, along with plastic medieval houses or ships. We believe that about half the models we sell are used by people who fight fantasy battles with them. The rest go to collectors, and while all the models we make are tied into some game or other, mainly Warhammer, we will never make models for their own sake. Our considerations are for the gamer, but we will try and make each one a model in its own right, and that's why in Highway, for example, the models won't be just representative tokens. Brian comments on his hopes for the new Rangers in America, where miniatures have not yet caught the imaginations of as many people as in Britain. So far, the signs are good, but with time running out for this interview, he'd like to ask you something. Going back to the generics, each sprue holds enough parts for 6 figures, with separate heads and weapons, but if you look at it, you can see that instead of 6 figures, we could have put 12 complete models there. So you could have 120 models for the same price as 60, but with less variety. So would you prefer the kind of conventional models you're used to, solid and unchangeable, or the ultimate variety in poses, as in the Marines? Or would you simply like something in between? There you have it, Citadel's new technology, figures and ambitions in a nutshell. What would you like them to do next? Thank you very much for watching. If you'd like to support the channel, then please be sure to like and subscribe, or even leave a comment. I always try my best to reply to them all. You can even now support the channel by joining the Patreon page, details of which are in the description below. Thank you again for watching, and always remember to drill your barrels.